We're going to move on to our next presentation. We have Bill Miaoulis, IT Security Officer. He's going to talk called CISO's Journey from Fortran Parts to Internet of Things. So strap in and enjoy.
Well, anyway, thank you for having us here. I think most of you know who I am. Y'all can find my information, but if not, there it is. We're going to just do kind of a little high level of security. We're going to talk about the journey we took. So I always want to start off a little bit of the definition of what security controls are. What is security when we talk about it? We talk about it over and over again. What are we really looking at? It's a condition that results. But the key is that you're trying to do not tend to bold things and say because they're important. Is what you're trying to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. And oftentimes, we people focus that you're only worried about confidentiality, but you're also worried about the data that you're looking at is actually valid. And that's really the harder part sometimes is the integrity piece of it. And then availability, we start talking about, is the data available? Do you have the backups? Do you have that? So it's really, again, you can implement any controls you want to. Some people say, well, what's secure? So that's really just a definition. It's, I give a second one, here from HIPAA, because I grew up, I think many of y'all know that most of my healthcare came, but you'll see those same three words. It's called the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability, reasonably anticipating threats, and you can use any security mechanism you want, Bill, to protect that. So it's not, very prescriptive sometimes. So everybody always has a solution. We just want to be in where they just told us they can solve everything. That's right. Right? We don't need firewalls anymore, right? We still need firewalls. We still need firewalls. And again, there's so many solutions. I just went to RSA, and there's hundreds of thousands of solutions, And so trying to make them all work together, but the key is you're trying to protect data. So we're going to be talking about risk as we have to ensure compliance. HIPAA says we have to ensure compliance by all you guys. The key term being ensure, not recommend, not whatever, ensure. So that's very difficult. That's the definition. And it says we can use any security mechanism. They want to be non-prescriptive because they knew it was going to change a lot. But I think that's important. So now we're going to get into really the journey. And the journey started with me in college at Auburn University in 1977. And so if any of you that are probably, most of y'all are too young to actually have ever had to key in a punch card like this. But this is what I did when I was at Auburn. This is these are not features. A month later. But the thing is, if any of you knew, you would go to the engineering building and you would punch the card. You would then have to take it and feed it into a machine that would read the cards. Then you'd have to go all the way over to Parker, which was old then, to get your results on the cards. Then you'd have to start the process back over. And God forbid you ever dropped a stack of cards. And all it was doing was a very simple thing of trying to create. It was actually a project we had in finance. It wasn't even an accounting class. And we did a project like Fortran to calculate price to earnings ratio. And we had a bunch of cards. It was that 80-digit card. But one of the things you learned is if you make a mistake on one card, the whole thing blows up. And so from a security standpoint, we still fight that one error that someone makes in a card in thousands and thousands of lines of code that allows a hacker now to get in and make a vulnerability. So you learn and you have to test, and you had to kind of validate. And so those testing and learning and validate have not changed since 1977. But I swore when I finished that class I would never work, and I used to have a curse word up there, but I took it off, and I will never work with computers again in my life in 1977. And again, most of y'all are not going to be able to learn that, but that was short-lived because 5 years later I was in something called an EDP auditor, and I was in banking. EDP stood for electronic data processing. And so this was at a time, that's the first luggable computer. Floppy disk, the amount of information. But the real key I want to talk about was, the ATM machines. ATMs were just coming in. And one of the projects we worked on was how do you validate who you are at an ATM machine. We still use that same technology today. And in fact, ATMs, many of y'all have heard that we kind of wanted to use something called two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication was around in 1982. Because you had to have a card, and you had to have something you know, a PIN. So again, when we're sitting here saying passwords didn't work, we knew passwords didn't work then. You know, you need to type in Miaoulis and then key in a 4-digit PIN because we knew back in 1982 that that security control didn't work. But here we are today, still having, y'all never have any professionals. Why do they make me key in two-factor to get to the VPN from anywhere in the world? I just want to walk up to the computer and get in. So again, it's just showing that even back in 82, even though 5 years sooner I didn't want to ever have anything to do with computers, we already had some two-factor authentication. So, you know, 5 years later, you know, we had not even thought about about people breaking in. So we're going to talk about a few things about social engineering, you know, my first hack. So the way I did my first hack was, and this is a true story, I was working you know, in energy, and so working for Southern National in Birmingham. And so the first hack we did is we knew everybody's username. Okay, it was the first initial, first 7 of your last name. I know all your usernames because I can go to PeopleFinder, or many of you if you work for Auburn University. So what we did is, being the person I is, we sat down with a listing of the phone directory, and back then they thought they were slick because they had a 4-digit password. And so I guessed Bama against every person on that list, and in 2 hours I had 14 logins, including the VP of HR, best year ever made money-wise, you know, right? But that's how simple it was. There was no control, there was no audit log for anyone to even know that I was doing it. There was no invalid user attempts. There was, you know, people say, well, you only get 3 guesses, Bill. I said, no, I don't need 3 guesses. I did 1 guess against each person, and I was in the system. Guess what? That's the way hackers work a lot today. Getting a username and trying to do a brute force. We just did it manually, but it's the same concept. It's the same process. So the second hack I ever had was, you know, I remember we were sitting there, and all you had to do was pick up and say, hey, this is so-and-so. I need my password reset. And sure enough, our lovely help desk, without any confirmation at all, would reset your password. And in fact, it's later when I got into, I was in banking. In banking, this actually happened sooner in banking. I remember I was, you know, excited, and I was talking to some bankers, and they said, well, how can we validate anyone, Bill? And we have to trust somebody. So yeah, just trust somebody on the other end on the phone. But social engineering is still something we fight today at help desk and service desk. How do you know who's at that other end when you need your passcode set? You know, your banks are doing the same thing. So guess what? Control hadn't changed that much in '87. And that is you have to be able to validate who you are. And so a couple of other things, just more notice. You know, we started moving from mainframe processing. We kept everything in control, and you sat there with a dumb terminal. Right? And we handled all the processing for you. When they said, no, we need to start moving more to distributed processing. And now the trend was, no, we need to take away all your controls at the distributed processing level in secure environments and do all the processing in the cloud for you. We need to store all your information for you. Because once it goes out, it goes out. You know, one of the biggest risks we have is not so much that it's distributed, is you can take that data and work on your home computer. You work on your home computer, that's distributed as it gets, that home computer stolen, we now have a reportable breach. So again, this was 1987, and then we started getting things like the first worm, first viruses, and I still think the virus companies wrote it, but I can't prove it. So that was always the room. Yeah. So again, as we're evolving, you know, not that much time has passed. 1993, we're getting into a thing called, you know, HIPAA. And nothing will make me madder when someone spells HIPAA with 2 P's. Okay? And they would come up and they would say, hey, we can make you HIPAA compliant. I get thousands of letters telling me they make HIPAA compliant, and about 300 of those 1,000 you get, would spell it with 2 P's.
You can chat private.
But they're going to make me compliant, right? And so we still see vendors that can, do this, no offense to vendors here, silver bullet solutions to security. And there are no silver bullet solutions to compliance. But what HIPAA taught us was, it was one of those first standards, we start talking about standards, that you have to meet. And what most people think, and I actually gave you the answer here, is when I would ask people what HIPAA would stand for, even amongst people that do healthcare, and almost always they'd say Health Information Privacy Act, or Privacy Protection Act, HIPPA. And I literally would do this presentation and get into argument with people that supposedly knew HIPAA. Okay, let's Google it, well, it's probably pre-Google, but anyway, no, it wasn't. But it stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Okay, and the reason was it was actually an insurance law that allowed you to take your insurance with you and take your information from your doctor's offices and go back and forth. It was how that transaction was written. And they said, if we're going to be taking all this electronic information back and forth, let's throw this underneath the regulation. So HIPAA was not written to protect your data. So again, it's something, but the key thing that we learned here is that, that it was coming up. We're going to talk about some of these other bullets in just a minute. Well, I think I'll go ahead and go back to this one. What is compliance? I think I have this in a future slide, but I'll go ahead and tell you. When we're dealing now with different standards that we have, I think a lot of y'all have heard of NIST 800-171. We have to meet different ISO 27001. You're still trying to meet a regulation. You're still trying to meet a standard. So compliance usually means you have a written practice, policy, procedure. You follow it, and then most importantly, you can document it. And again, it was why protect health information. So one of the things that HIPAA told us we had to do was conduct risk assessment. Every standard that I look at and see, one of the first things they tell you to do is to do a risk assessment. And so it is also the one that if you look over and over again, people would have a trouble deciding what a risk assessment is. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of a risk assessment. I don't know how many of you have ever done a formal risk assessment, but everyone does risk assessment every day. But the example I always give is my in-laws, when I got married 24, 25 years ago, they said, you don't need a security system at your house. You live in a secure neighborhood, everything's fine. They live within a mile of us. Okay, you're just wasting your money. That's okay, we feel better wasting our money, right? I won't ask you how many of you have security systems, but different people put different controls on place. I mean, I grew up in a place where we didn't, we would leave the car running with the kids in it when you went to the grocery store, right? Things changed. But some people lock their doors. Some people lock their front and back doors. Some people put an alarm system. So we all do that risk assessment when you left today and made a decision as to what your risk tolerance is going to be. So what happened was about a year and a half after we got married, my in-laws went out and their house got broken into. And I could just see that next day, that guy that was selling the security system, their risk analysis had changed, right? Because their best judgment, you were never going to get broken into. They did a risk assessment, and they were wrong. But I could still see that salesman going, hey, would you like? Before they could get the word out, it was yes. They had a panel that big on their house in 1983, 1995, okay? We had a little bit of them because their risk changed. And so this is what this slide is really telling us. When we're doing risk assessment, we're trying to figure out what can happen to our data. How could someone get to our information? How could someone get to the confidentiality? How could someone do a denial of service about the availability? How could someone go in and change the grades for a student?
So when you create this,
so that even though they earned a D, like this, for instance, they get greedy and usually put an A, and that's how they get, right? So that's really what you're talking about security. When you're talking about doing a risk assessment, you're really just talking about thinking what can happen. What bad can happen? How can people get to your data? And you write it down, and you get into things called probability and likelihood. How likely is going to happen, and what's the impact? And if you go back to HIPAA, one of the things they tell you have to do is if you have a security incident, that should tell you that it may happen again. If you lost a laptop that had information on it that was unencrypted and had to do a reportable breach, guess what? Unless you put something to change that, that might happen again.
Anybody that's on the distributed.
And that was, frowned upon. So this is really risk assessment, learning about what you think. Or if you read in the paper that such and such, somebody put a device on or something happened at another university or another school, and you go, look at them up there in that northern part of the state.
Don't have to worry so much about them.
Now, what you're supposed to be saying is could it happen here? Could it happen at all? And the answer is you can read about many things that happen at universities or healthcare or something. We have to ask ourselves, can it happen here? Can someone take advantage of operating systems that have not been patched and hack into systems? Yes. In the city of Atlanta, that was mentioned earlier, who someone said it was a 3-day event. It's still going on. You still can't do some of the stuff. Could we get hit by ransomware here today? What have we done to prevent ransomware? What have we done to prevent data exfiltration? What should we be doing is really risk analysis. And so we're going to, so that's risk assessment. And I kind of covered it a little bit. And when you look at the HIPAA rule, this was the foundation of their rule. But it's also, if you look at HIPAA, the reason I do HIPAA because I did it for 20-something years, but it's also the first one. And it's easier for us to understand. So they tell you have to do risk analysis and you have to do risk management. So many of you may be having to deal with NIST 800-71 soon. So you do a risk analysis, but you have to have a plan to address it. What's our plan to address ransomware? What are some of the controls that we're doing? One of the main controls is, do you have a good solid backup? You're not backing up. Do you have a visibility on that east-west traffic? Do you have good endpoint protection? Quite frankly, for the people in the room, we're looking at getting better endpoint protection. So a plan, implement procedures. So the best day to have security controls in was yesterday. The next best day is to plan for it and do it. But one of the keys for HIPAA was they said you had to have a sanction policy. And I'm going to pick on poor Phil here, but Phil says, Bill, can we sanction someone for not doing X? Have you ever said that? Every breath he takes, okay? And so what happens is HIPAA said this was critical to the rule. And in fact, I think this just tells the whole security story. Because sanctions don't work on a hacker sitting in China or Russia or Nigeria. Sanctions really work for our own employees. You're supposed to take SANS training for a new employee, but if you don't, we don't care. You're supposed to keep your servers patched so a hacker can't get in. But if you don't, that's okay, stay on that. You're supposed to change your passwords every 6 months, but if you don't, we won't pay attention. You're supposed to use multi-factor, but can you give me an exception? Because I don't know how to use two-factor authentication. It's been around since 1982, right? Or before that, actually. It's probably the beginning of time. And then the one that gets missed a lot is information system activity group. And that is oftentimes we can't prevent something from happening, but you want to detect it.
You have to know about the system before you can log it.
You have to know about a system before you can log it.
You can't log unknown systems.
You can't log unknown systems. But what we're talking about oftentimes, and again, I'll give a healthcare example. We would see where someone would look up and say, well, what grades? Well, we'll say, what is someone in the hospital for? Why is Bill in the hospital?
You could use your channels as.
And so we could run nurses and say, oh, look at everyone that looked at his record. And then you can tell if someone looked at it inappropriately.
That's a team. And then could you have, say, 3 or 4.
That's what audit log does for you. It does after the fact detection. If we suspected that someone was harvesting social security numbers, it would be nice if in the banner system I could tell who was using that application software to view things outside their area.
That's more government.
If we find out that these, so again, knowing that. One of the other things it tells you to do is look at your access reports. Are you reviewing who has access to your servers, your systems, your apps all the time? And is that access still needed? What if they left the employment 6 months ago? What information do they have? And then security incident track reports goes back to that whole risk assessment, risk analysis. So I covered this earlier, but again, I'm staying with HIPAA. Is they say you must have policies and procedures. And so it's important that you have them written. It's one of the things we've been trying to do over the last couple of years. What are our standards? I get it asked every day. In fact, I got asked today, what can I store in box? Oh, I need a policy on it. We've been working on it for 4 months. But the idea is right now, we don't really want you storing any, it's written on the website, it's not, no socials. Something, why? Because we feel that the risk of a reportable breach might get us. So when you're trying, and it says HIPAA compliance, but I'm going to give this one again just, briefly. How do you know if you're compliant with a particular standard? And everybody deals with standard. Many of you are going to be involved in research, and you're going to get in your contracts. Must meet NIST 800-171. Some of you work in parts of Auburn that are healthcare. How do you know you're compliant? And this is pretty standard government stuff. You have a written policy / procedure / standard / practice. You follow your policy, but here's the key. You can prove it. If an examiner comes in and says, do you have a risk assessment? Have you ever analyzed the risk within your area? You have to have some written form that you've gone through. If you're doing, again, I'm going to point out to research, because you guys are the ones that control it. I can't do that for you. Okay? So you have to prove it. So the idea is document, document, document. And sadly, I think this is the biggest security control we like to have happen everywhere I ever go. We keep our head in the sand and say, it's just not going to happen here. Security's hard. We don't need multi-factor. We don't need two-factor authentication. But what happened is when we first got here, people didn't want to have two-factor to get into the network. Sure enough, we were able to put that in. And sure enough, I went and talked to every dean, and I said, now, Dean, there's 2 or 3 professors who are going to fight us on this. He said, yes. I said, you know who they are already before they complained. He said, yes. And every dean said the same answer. I said, could you go talk to those 2 or 3 guys ahead of time? Because they're going to complain after. So we all know that about security control. And so sometimes we want to take this path of least resistance and assume that we don't have a problem with something. And again, I'm not going to get into any risk. And then I'm going to take just a couple of minutes and talk about breach notification laws. We have one with HIPAA. How many people are aware that Alabama became the 50th state to pass a breach notification law? Just a few weeks ago. We fell behind. South Dakota, I think, beat us by 2 days. There is talking about, how many people know what GDPR stands for? Protection regulation, which is in the EU, which means if we have a breach, we have to report it within 72 hours. We're also going to have new controls we have to put it over our websites and how we use our data. And one of the things we have to do from a security standpoint is they're going to have the right to be forgotten. And that means if they did something at Auburn that we don't have to keep that information for legal reasons, we have to go out and erase them from our existence. And that includes IP. And what are other countries going to be coming up with breach notification that pushes in security? I mentioned some of these standards. Again, they all apply the same. Criminal justice standards, prescription drug abuse. We talk about attack vectors. When you talk about risk, you talk about attack vectors. We all think about email. One of the risks that I've seen people do is we'll just leave thumb drives lying around so he'll pick them up and stick them in a machine. You'd be shocked how many will. Ransomware has just hit your organization. The World Wide Web, most people think of hackers, internal people. So I've got just a couple of minutes. And, when I got to Auburn, I called it returning to the Wild Wild West. And again, part of it was because we started getting even new standards and new things that we had to comply with. And there's always a chart, right, to get. So again, are we compliant? That's the same slide. And the controls really changed. And so we're talking about risk assessment, two-factor authentication, passwords, firewalls. So I probably talked a little long. I think I thought I had a couple more minutes. But anyway, we look back 40 years ago when I was at Auburn University, no upper deck. We looked at Auburn, we considered the security controls were just decks, but we didn't even know what cybersecurity was. I used to tell people when I was in cybersecurity over 20-something years, what do? I work with computers, because there was no comprehension of information security. Just easier. Can you fix my laptop? My printer won't work, okay? That's what people thought about computers, but now people know. But this is where we're going in the future, and we got to figure out some of the same controls that are going to help us protect. They've hacked your self-driving cars. They've hacked your Jeep. You know, how do we prevent that and allow that technology that we heard in the Congress wanted to happen? The fifth bullet down, digital immortality. I don't know if you paid attention to this, but it's where you're going to be able to upload your entire consciousness into a computer.
Thanks.
Become a cyborg. How many people believe in cyborgs? I believe we already have it. We just haven't attached it to our brain yet. As we walk around, so we talk about the circle, and we look down in 40 years, can we imagine what we have to do? And security's got to use some of those same old techniques from 40 years ago, 40 years in the future, still control things. Code written. We've done risk analysis before we allow certain systems to be written. So with that, I don't know if I have a couple of minutes for kind of end the presentation. If I have any questions for me, y'all know where to find me.